Hello, everybody. Welcome in to GoVols247's 2022 Tennessee football season preview. Looking ahead to the start of the season, which is exactly 3 weeks away from today. As we speak, in about 3 weeks, we'll be just a few hours away from kickoff between Tennessee and Ball State over at Neyland Stadium. Joined by Patrick Brown, our head football writer at GoVols247. I'm Ryan Callahan. We'll be breaking it down here for the next little bit, taking your questions, discussing everything about this Tennessee football season coming up, and it should be a pretty fascinating year, really. Expectations are higher for the Vols, coming off a pretty encouraging first season for them under Josh Heupel last year, and this team's got a lot of important players coming back, led by obviously quarterback Hendon Hooker, wide receiver Cedric Tillman, some fascinating players on this team, and an explosive offense that people are expecting to make Tennessee maybe a bit of a surprise team this year in the SEC East and maybe even across the conference. So we'll dive right in here. Go ahead and like and subscribe the 247 Sports YouTube channel here as we discuss this. There's going to be a lot more on this channel, obviously, as we approach the start of the college football season. And check out GoVols247.com, where we obviously post a lot of stuff throughout the year, but especially this time of year during preseason camp as we get ready for the start of the season. Tons of good content there and plenty more on the way. We'll talk some recruiting, I'm sure, at some point during this as well. So any questions you have, any topic related to Tennessee football, we'll do our best to tackle it here during this show. And Patrick, let's just dive right in with what I kind of touched on a second ago, the expectations for this team. I think we saw it last month at SEC Media Days in Atlanta. Tennessee was picked to finish third in the SEC East and finished 3 points in that poll behind Kentucky for second place. We thought they might even be picked to finish second in the East. So clearly it's a different team, a different sort of day for this program compared to where it was a year ago when there were really no expectations around that team going into their first year under Josh Heupel. What should fans expect for this team going into this season, and what are they expecting right now as we get ready for this season?
Yeah, Ryan, I think Tennessee fans are expecting more. They're expecting that win total to increase this fall, which is fair with what Tennessee has coming back on both sides of the football, with the way that they're going to play offense under Josh Heupel. And Alex Golesh, the offensive coordinator, with Hendon Hooker and Cedric Tillman coming back to lead that side of the football. There's reason to be optimistic about winning 8, maybe 9 games. I caution going 10-2 was a record thrown out on the SEC Network today, I believe, by Roman Harper, one of the analysts over there. I'm not sure I'm ready to go 10-2 yet, and I think a lot of Tennessee fans are a little bit more realistic. And I know a lot of folks on our board over at GoVols247 with the on the checkerboard were like, what's he thinking over there? Because I think he picked Tennessee to win at Georgia. I'm not ready to go there. I think a lot of realistic fans aren't ready to go there either. But this is the time of the year where optimism is kicking in. Everybody looks good in fall camp. And certainly I think that Tennessee, the expectations are higher because of what they did last year. They were low going into last year after everything that happened. But they really played an exciting, energetic brand of football. They were in a lot of games. They were competitive. And they won some games and probably could have won a couple other games that didn't go their way. So they weren't that far off from even winning 8 or 9 games last season. So expectations are higher. They were a fringe top 25 team. We'll see if they get in the top 25 of the AP poll that's coming out next week. So certainly expectations are higher. But as Josh Heupel would say, that's what you expect, and that's what you want when you come to Tennessee.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that offense that I think is the reason expectations are pretty high for this team going into this season. You've got Hendon Hooker back after he kind of took over the starting job a couple games into last season after Joe Milton's got off to a bit of a slow start, got injured, opened the door for Hooker, and he kind of took the job and ran. And 31 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. Hard to have any problems with anything he did last year at the quarterback position. And if he can get even better from that, how good could this offense be? But you bring back him, you bring back Cedric Tillman, who was their leading receiver a year ago. Jabari Small, the starting running back, is back, and you bring back 4 starters on the offensive line with with Cade Mays being the only one not back from that group a year ago. And that's a big spot that we'll probably touch on at some point during this preview. But with that side of the ball, I mean, that seems to be Tennessee's strength going into this season. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, I think that's where a lot of the expectations are coming from, is just the thought that offense, with all those guys back and with what Josh Heupel's system typically produces, that they're going to be pretty good and score their fair share of points, right?
Yeah, it starts to me with Hendon Hooker. He's the face of this program. He's the leader of this team. And his starts last season, I think Tennessee averaged 40 points a game. I think we're over 480 yards per game. They're going to play fast. The tempo is hard to prepare for, even I know some other fans in the SEC probably think, they'll figure it out. Tennessee's offense will be as good. Defensive coordinators think will figure it out. But Josh Heupel and his staff are going to evolve this offense as well. And we've already heard things about Hendon Hooker being able to manipulate defenses a little bit more and things like that. And he's going to have a better understanding of the game as well. And so are a lot of the guys around him with 8 starters back. You got a lot of guys that they've now adjusted to playing and living at the tempo that Tennessee plays at. So, and Heupel's done it every year. I mean, even going back at UCF, there was no drop off. Both his seasons at Missouri were pretty good. There wasn't really any sort of drop off there. So, I think it's reasonable to keep expectations that Tennessee can score 40 points a game, maybe even get closer to 42, 45 if they're really clicking and if they keep everybody healthy on that side of the ball. They still have to, got to find a left tackle. They got to get some receivers to step up that haven't previously done it. But, we weren't talking about Cedric Tillman being an all SEC caliber player at this point last year, and Bayless Jones Jr. wouldn't have been a 3rd-round draft pick this time a year ago too. So guys are going to emerge. I think there's confidence within the team and in the staff that those receivers they'll get enough production there to keep clicking at a pretty high clip.
And not surprising, but I think we have a question here on Hendon Hooker going into the season. Tyler Chambers asked, could you see Hendon Hooker as a dark horse Heisman candidate? I've heard a little bit about this throughout the offseason, Patrick, and I think whether he could win it is maybe a different discussion, but could you see him as at least a contender for the Heisman Trophy, a guy who maybe gets an invite to New York for that ceremony later this year?
No, it's hard for me to see that just because that award is so tied to team results. I think Tennessee would really have to, they'd have to go 10-2 or better for Hooker to be in that realm. But you look at his numbers last year, you went over some of them. 31 touchdowns. I think he had over 600 rushing yards as well, despite all the sacks that Tennessee gave up, and just 3 interceptions. If think about him with a full offseason in the system, full offseason with this staff, you expect those numbers to go up, and that's a high bar that Hooker has set for himself. But that's what special players do. They set high bars and then they surpass those expectations. That's what those guys do, and I think Hooker fits in that category. I think one of the best things we've heard from Tennessee this month was talking to quarterbacks coach Joey Halsey about how they had to get Hooker to kind of loosen up, how to stop being so serious all the time. You want to be a hard worker, but just sort of relax and have fun. And that's the kind of quarterback that this offense needs, is a guy that's going out there and ripping it and having fun. And Hooker, they were unable to unlock that from him last year, and the results were really impressive. And now that he's even more settled in, having even more fun, he's attacked the game even probably more than he did last year. In terms of living in the complex, studying film, I think he can be better, absolutely, than he was last season. I would kind of downplay some of the Heisman talk just because I think that's such an award that the best teams, the best player on the best team is usually who that defaults to. And I don't know that Tennessee, I think Hooker will be their best player, but I don't know that Tennessee will be good enough as a team. I don't know that they'll be record-wise able to get him significantly into that conversation where he potentially is in New York in December.
One of those positions around Hendon Hooker that I think will play a big role in determining maybe just how good Tennessee's offense will be this season is running back. We have a question about Tennessee's running back situation and their newest addition to that room that has been obviously one of the big topics during preseason camp so far. Linjay Dixon, how's he coming along, and how does he fit into the running back room? If you're not familiar with the story, he's a former 4-star prospect out of high school, once committed to Tennessee while he was coming out of high school, ended up signing with Clemson, started his college career there, ran for more than 1,400 yards during his time at Clemson, entered the transfer portal a year ago, and then ended up at West Virginia earlier this year, and then entered the transfer portal again in June, only to end up at Tennessee here recently and joining them in the first days of preseason camp. So, Patrick, how does he fit into that group, and what have you seen from him so far? How's he coming along?
Well, with Dixon, you got to remember he's been here a week, so and things move pretty quickly from the time that he got on campus for a visit, when he got on campus for good, when he started practicing. I think he only was in full pads for the first time for their scrimmage on Tuesday. So how much does he even know what's going on right now with Tennessee's offense? They're trying to catch him up. He's joining an offense that, as we talked about, has so many guys back that they're moving at their own rate. They're not waiting for Dixon. They're not waiting for Bru McCoy to sort of catch up. They're going to operate how they're going to operate with all the guys they've got back that have been in the system. So it's going to be a slow build with Dixon. I think it's a low risk kind of move, Ryan. I think they needed to add a guy there after Lenith Whitehead went down for the season with his injury back in July, and with the 4 scholarship running backs they had, 2 of them were freshmen. So that's a big risk, and obviously that's a position where you need 4 or 5 guys at least over the course of a season, as many hits as those guys take, and the wear and tear and all that. But Dixon, he looks good athletically. I think it's just a matter of getting him kind of caught up and seeing what he can do and getting him to learn the offense. I think that's where they've got to start with him. But I think over time, I think they're going to need all those guys in the backfield at some point. And certainly I think that's what you're building to with Dixon, and he gives them some depth there, but also could be a guy that if you have a guy or 2 go down that you can rely on, you hope by that point you have him caught up to speed where he can get in the game and not have much of a drop off. And the big question with him is are you going to get the guy that was at Clemson earlier in his career, right? Because that's when he was the most productive, not the guy that sort of tailed off a little bit in 2020, 2021, and went to West Virginia. It didn't work out there. So if you can sort of bring back what he was earlier in his career, that would be a huge steal for Tennessee, given that they got him, as late as they did.
And obviously, just like us, I think fans are naturally drawn to sort of the new faces. Linjay Dixon, obviously the newest face on that offensive unit. But another guy that's gotten a lot of talk this offseason is Bru McCoy, the USC wide receiver transfer. We have a question about him. Will Bru be eligible? And if so, what impact will he have? His eligibility is still not conclusively decided. Tennessee still is awaiting word on that. Patrick, do we have any sort of update on that? And then also, what kind of role do you foresee for him? Do you think he will be a day one starter, make a big impact, or is that still something that remains to be seen?
Yeah, I think Tennessee fans have been through so many of these eligibility situations over the years, right? Whether it was Cade Mays, whether it was Aubrey Solomon, those are even some of the recent ones. There's probably some older, even more back in the day guys that I'm forgetting. But Tennessee remains optimistic that he will be able to be eligible and will be able to play this season. But with these things, you just never really know until you know, right? So they're hoping to find out as soon as they can. I haven't sensed any alteration in terms of how they're how many reps they're giving him in practice, mainly because they're trying to catch him up. He's a guy that he didn't play last season while suspended at USC. He didn't have a spring because he was trying to figure out where he was going. He came off had an injury in the off season that he was trying to work his way back from. So a lot of rust there, and we kind of noticed that out there on the practice field the first couple of days. He started to look a little bit better, look a little bit more fluid. And he picked up an injury. I don't know how much he scrimmaged the other day when Tennessee held its first preseason scrimmage. But if he's caught up and his conditioning is where it needs to be, and he picks up the offense, he's a guy that I think a starter caliber player for Tennessee. And I think he matches well with Cedric Tillman. They're both really big guys. You see him out there on the practice field, big bodies. Going to be tough to match up with if they're getting single coverage. And if Tennessee's able to get some other wide receivers to emerge, maybe Cedric Tillman sees more single coverage or gets less attention because those other guys are threats that our defenses have to worry about. So, and I think McCoy is a big piece of that because I think he's a guy that if you leave him in single coverage, he can make some things happen with his frame and with his athleticism. But it's still, been a little bit more, maybe a week and a half of camp. They're still trying to get his stamina going, get him sort of caught up in the offense. But if they can get him clicking, I think he's a guy that's going to be a difference maker for Tennessee and a guy that's a starter wide receiver.
I'll say this too. We've talked about this before on our GoVols247 podcast and plenty on GoVols247.com, Patrick. But throughout the offseason, been a lot of talk about Jalen Hyatt and the improvements he's made since last year too. I think if I'm a Tennessee fan, I'm betting a little bit more on Jalen Hyatt being the guy who maybe emerges as the big threat opposite Cedric Tillman, even though he's going to be lining up in the slot. It might be like last year where you had Tillman outside, Bayless Jones Jr. in the slot, and then the other outside receiver, Javonte Payton. He made some big plays, especially in the first quarter throughout last season, but he kind of disappeared in a lot of games. I wonder if Bru McCoy doesn't end up being that third guy that maybe doesn't have quite the eye-popping numbers Tillman does, but makes a few big plays here and there and still ends up with solid production throughout the year. I can see that maybe where Hyatt maybe ends up being the second leading receiver behind Tillman, and McCoy ends up being the high-profile addition, but maybe not the big production guy. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think if you were buying stock or projecting what the season's going to look like, I think Hyatt would, at this point, I would say Hyatt would have a better season than Bru McCoy. And Hyatt's been a guy, he's gotten a lot of pub this offseason for what he's done. And listening to him talk after practice on Thursday, it's the same thing. He sounds like a guy that's really locked in, that's confident in what he's accomplished all offseason, has kept his nose to the grindstone in terms of living in the complex, getting as much work as he can. I think he was motivated by last season not going like he wanted to. And you mentioned Velus Jones, right? He watched how Velus was productive and watched how Velus, the numbers he put up, the things he did out of the slot. He was able to change his life. He's a third-round draft pick, got a chance to play a lot for the Bears right now. So if Hyatt shows he's locked in and is a little bit bigger and a little bit stronger, has more confidence, then he's going to capitalize on this offense because he's going to get opportunities. He's going to get space to make plays. He's going to get good matchups where he can use his speed against safeties, nickel guys, all that kind of thing. So, yeah, I would lean toward Hyatt making, maybe at this point, if you're projecting, I think he was probably the best bet to be the number 2 receiver in terms of production. But I think they're going to need him to step up. They're going to need a lot of different guys to step up because I think for the rest of that position group, it's all about trying to take defense's attention away from Tillman because Tennessee's opponents are going to go into games saying we can't let forward beat us, and they're going to shade a safety over there, double him, things like that. So if Tennessee can get some guys that can show some consistency, whether it be Hyatt, McCoy, some of these other guys that have been sort of popping up here and there during camp, then that's going to make Cedric Tillman's job a lot easier, and that's going to keep Tennessee's offense clicking at a pretty high rate. No question.
We've talked a lot about the offense so far. Really, though, in some ways, the story about the season for Tennessee might come down to just how much, if any, improvement do we see out of the defense, and can the defense give them enough help for the offense to win some games? So we've got a question here about the defense. Could the improved depth on defense and familiarity with the system help enough to move the team to 9 to 10 wins? This is a big storyline to me because I think they do have better depth, Patrick. Wouldn't you agree? And that maybe opens the door for that. But the flip side of that is not a lot of proven difference makers on defense. Byron Young is sort of the big name returning, but otherwise a lot of guys who've been okay players or solid players in the past, but can they take another step and be more than that? But what do you think about that? Can that improved depth help enough to get this team to 9 or 10 wins like some fans are hoping?
Yeah, I guess if you're taking the optimistic route, Ryan, you're hoping that maybe the quality comes from the quantity, right? Tennessee had too many guys, whether it was Jeremy Banks, Aaron Beasley at linebacker, those 2 safeties, just played too many snaps last season. And Tennessee played, I think, the 4th most snaps on defense in the country. It's going to be the same thing this year. I don't know that they'll have a game like Kentucky last year where the offense was on the field for, not even 14 minutes. Yeah. But there's going to be some games where Tennessee's defense is on the field for 80, 90 plays, and they need to be fresher in the 4th quarter of those close games. They need to be fresher on those third downs. That's obviously the biggest area I think Tennessee defense can improve is getting off the field more on third down. So if you're able to stay fresher, if you're able to maybe bring a guy in that hasn't played much, maybe he's got that little bit of extra juice to make the play and come up with the stop to help you get off the field, I think that can help. And we've heard Josh Heupel talk about it. He thinks they'll be deeper on the defensive line, which they're going to rotate there. He thinks they can be deeper in the secondary, which some of the new additions, they got a couple of transfers in there that I think are going to make an impact. And like you said, they need some guys to take sort of that Theo Jackson-like step where they make a big jump from one year to the next. Byron Young's a good name. I think he's a guy that's done that. Tyler Barron is another guy that's gotten a lot of talk this offseason. You can get those edge guys going. That makes your job as a defensive coordinator a lot easier on third down because you can sit back in coverage and let those guys try to get home. So that's where I think the defense has to improve the most is third down and specifically the ability to get home with 4 guys because, with the questions they have at cornerback, the linebackers and safeties weren't great in coverage last year. How much improvement can you get from those guys? I think the onus is really on the front to be able to, again, replicate what they did last year where they had over 100 tackles for loss. They got teams behind the chains because then they couldn't get off the field on third down. If you get off the field on third down and get guys home and affect the quarterback, then I think that's the biggest area where this defense can take a jump because I think they gave up over 50% third down conversions in SEC play. It's just way too high. And those are demoralizing plays too. When you let Matt Corral scramble for 15 yards on 3rd and 10. That's a demoralizing play because you're that close to getting off the field. And if you're Tennessee's defense, you're thinking that every time you go to the sideline and you let your offense back on the field, they're going to go score. So that's what I think this Tennessee defense has to do. They have to be better situationally, whether it be third down, red zone, things like that.
Yeah, they were so good on 1st and 2nd down at times last year and just would get in 3rd and long and just couldn't make anything happen. I think this year that's where maybe the optimism comes from is that they feel they're better equipped to get after the quarterback with a 4-man rush. So many times they had to bring blitzes last year on those 3rd and long plays to try to affect the quarterback, and that exposes your secondary that's already, kind of average-ish, I guess you could say, those guys have to make a play, and when you expose them and have guys blitzing, that just gives them more of a chance of finding someone open. So this year they need to get after the quarterback with four pass rushers, and I think they feel they're better equipped to do that. And can they do that? That's maybe one of the biggest positive developments I thought that maybe came out of the first scrimmage. Of course, it was closed to media. We didn't get to see it, but from what Josh Heupel said, they were able to make more stops in the red zone, or at least make a few stops in the red zone. For this team, that could be the difference between winning and losing. As you said, if they're going to score 40-ish points a game, just make a few stops in the red zone sometimes, and that's going to be enough to get you out of there with the win. That's just easier said than done for this team sometimes.
Yeah, and maybe the Kentucky game is a great example because they didn't get many stops in that game, but the offense was scoring just about every time it had it. But the defense came up with the stop late in the game. They got the pick six as well, and sometimes that's all it needs. And there were stretches of games last season where Tennessee's defense, I think, played better than the people are remembering. Of course, everyone just remembers the Purdue game. That was a disaster defensively just about. But even in that game, they had a stretch, I think in the third quarter, where they got 2 picks and 2 stops, and Tennessee, their offense wasn't able to go capitalize on it. So they've got to be a little bit more, or maybe be a little bit less boom or bust, because it seemed like last season they was either 3 and out or they were giving up a touchdown. So if they could improve some of those situational things, then I think this defense is capable of being maybe middle of the pack in the SEC. I don't know about top half. End of the top half, I think, is realistic. Top, upper third, upper fourth, that seems to maybe be a stretch given the personnel. But middle of the pack in the SEC on defense with this group, with the offense they have, could be enough to get a couple more games in the win total.
Yeah, every third down conversion doesn't need to lead to a 14-play scoring drive. We've got a question about Josh Heupel entering his second year. This is I appreciate the kind words. Said this is great so far. My question: have you been impressed by Heupel? Is he someone you see sticking around for a while? This is maybe the biggest question. We've talked about this year alone, but obviously Tennessee's had trouble getting out of this cycle of 3 or 4 years, and maybe 5 years in Butch Jones's case, and on to the next coach. Josh Heupel's at least shown signs, I would say, of being someone who has the potential to be a longer-term fit for Tennessee. At the same time, there was a lot of optimism. I remind people, a lot of optimism going into year 2 under Butch Jones too, and other times throughout this past 15 years or so for Tennessee. So, where do you fall in this, Patrick? I mean, are you still in wait and see mode a little bit because it is early and because we have seen this before, or are you starting to believe Heupel might be different from some of the guys we've seen before?
Yeah, some of the viewers may not think we're doing a good job when I point out that even Jeremy Pruitt won 8 games in a row at one point. So we've had these points with the past couple of coaches that there's early optimism, right? They do some good things. Things seem to be going well. I do think Heupel likes being here. I think he likes coaching in the SEC. I think he feels that this program has a lot of potential. He brags on this program all the time about the brand, the reach. He loves the city, I think. And I think they've done a good job as a staff of coming in and creating a culture. You're at this point, you're always one bad year away from being on the hot seat in this business, right? I mean, look at Dan Mullen at Florida. He had 3 great years, and then things went south really quickly last season, and now he's not at Florida anymore. So, some cautious optimism. I do think with Heupel, his calling card is always going to be he's always going to have a good offense. And as we heard Kelsey Pope, their new wide receivers coach today, say he's always going to have a good quarterback. So they obviously got a good one right now. I think that's a lot of reason for the optimism going into this season is that for the first time since Josh Dobbs was here, Tennessee has there's not a competition and there's not really a concern at quarterback with Hendon Hooker and the way he played last season and the expectations that he can be even better in year 2. But I think Heupel has that's going to be his calling card with the offense. They're always going to put up points. They're always going to be exciting. Is that going to be enough? Are they going to be able to win enough shootouts if they can't maybe recruit better defensively or maybe scheme things up a little bit better defensively? But the way they play offense puts a lot of stress on that side of the ball too. So, a cautious optimism at this point. You like what you've seen so far. Heupel seems to be a guy that's fairly laid back. I'm sure he can, peel some paint off the walls as most football coaches can. He doesn't strike me as the guy that's going to get purple in the face like Butch Jones did, or grab a player by the face mask like we saw Jeremy Pruitt do. He's maybe a little bit more laid back in that, but again, we don't get to see him all the time, so I'm sure there's some times where he gets pretty mad. But he seems to be a little bit more of a laid back, maybe sort of a regular guy than some of the guys that Tennessee's had before him. So that gives you some hope that he can sort of break the cycle that you mentioned of a coach starting off well, creating some optimism, and then things go south.
I know in a head coach, you tend to just be, as a fan, you want to see something that's just different from what you've had before. It's like a bad ex-girlfriend. Your next one's going to have something that's completely the opposite, or at least not have that certain quality that drove you nuts about the previous one. So I'll give you a couple of things on this that maybe give you reason for optimism. One is that the offense is always going to be good. I think that is different. On top of that, that gives you a chance to at least be competitive. I think that's why I buy Josh Heupel being able to get Tennessee to a point where they're more competitive on a regular basis. Maybe a bigger discussion to be had about whether his system and his playing style is going to put Tennessee in position to win SEC championships down the road. But I think at least he can get them back in the discussion long term. Two, I think he's more comfortable in his own skin, able to handle the spotlight, the fishbowl that Knoxville and Tennessee can be as a football program. Butch Jones, I think sometimes he was his own worst enemy, just worrying about too many different things, perception, things like that. I don't think Josh Heupel will have that problem. And he's been a head coach before, so he doesn't have the inexperience problem that Jeremy Pruitt, I think, had, that ultimately was his downfall in a lot of ways. And then combine that with this new NIL era for everybody across college football and recruiting. I think that's something that benefits Tennessee because it's a program with a big fan base, a lot of money, a lot of big money donors, things like that. So I think all that together gives Tennessee a chance to at least get back in the discussion across the SEC and maybe start competing for championships again. Will they get there? Can they get back to the top under Josh Heupel? Time will tell. But for me, I'm buying it a little more that he can at least hang around for a while and get Tennessee to be more relevant again than they've been in a while. We have a quick question on another specific player. Is there any hope for Juwan Mitchell in 2022? This is, Patrick, maybe the player I get asked about most who's not projected, I would say, as of right now, to be in the starting lineup. He's a really interesting player, former Texas transfer, was a starter at Texas a couple years ago. He's still in the mix there at linebacker. What do you think? Is there any hope for him? And if so, what kind of role do you maybe see for him this year?
Well, I'm laughing at the asker of the question. Trey
Yes.
Scott, our own, he loves to know how former Longhorns are doing. I'm surprised he didn't ask about Bru McCoy earlier. Hopefully that's not too soon, since Bru was only at Texas for about 6 months maybe. So with Mitchell, I think he can be a good player. Is he going to be healthy? He seems like he's healthier this camp. He hasn't been really healthy. I don't think he came in with the injury that ultimately sidelined him when he got on campus last year. And can he be locked in? Can he be a better teammate? That's been a lot of the question in addition to the injury. And that's probably the biggest question now, right? Because, again, he looks healthy. He's moved around pretty well from what we've seen in camp. And if he's a guy that can be locked in and motivated, I think he can be a guy that gives them some quality snaps at linebacker. I don't think he's going to be a starter. I know, Jeremy Banks was a pretty good player, I thought, last season. He can get better. And Aaron Beasley is one of those guys that a lot of fans aren't really fond of. There's a few guys on that defense that probably fall into that category, and he's one of them. But I think he's going to remain the starter until further notice. And Mitchell can be a guy that spells them off the bench. They started out last season rotating with those three guys plus Solon Page. I think you could see another rotation like that this year where they sort of platoon in two different groups. I probably wouldn't have Jeremy Banks off the field that often because I think he's one of your best defensive players. But, if you can give some of those guys, a series off in the first half, maybe in the third quarter of games, the games that are tight, the fourth quarter kind of games that you're going to have, then maybe you're pressure down the line. Mitchell's a guy that led Texas in tackles a couple years ago, so he can be a productive player. I think he can be a good run defender. But again, he has to sort of take care of his own house before he can really think about making an impact. But things do seem to be trending toward him helping this defense this season. And I think he's a key guy in terms of Tennessee wants to play more depth. Coaches have talked about having more guys. I think he's one of those guys that's key in that conversation about being able to give Tennessee some quality depth.
I've still been in wait and see mode with him, but I do think there is maybe a little more substance to the coach's positive comments about him lately. I think there's at least a chance we see certainly more of a contribution from him than last year when we only saw him play in the first couple games before he kind of shut it down for the season, had surgery, and we didn't see him again. And Tennessee's linebacker rotation was cut down. So that he's an interesting wild card for this team. There are several, I would say, on defense, though, and I think still some more important pieces. But he is one that's getting a lot of questions during preseason camp from fans who want to see better linebacker play, no question, and just aren't sure those other guys, based on what they saw last year, can give it to them. So I can certainly understand that. Let's get to the most important question, though, Patrick. Overall, what is the top number of wins you could see Tennessee having if everything goes right? This person says, I think 8-4, 9-3 would be a successful season. I think that's actually a pretty healthy place to put the bar. I do think 9-3 still is even asking for some things to go Tennessee's way, injury luck being maybe top among them, and you still got to take care of business in a lot of games that are not shoe-ins. But Patrick, what do you think? What's the top number of wins? What's the ceiling for this team if everything went right?
I mean, if everything went right, I think the absolute dream scenario would be 10-2. I just don't think that's happening. This league is too tough for that to happen. I think Tennessee still has too many holes for that to be realistic. I do think 8-4, 9-3. I think that would qualify as success. That's a good point from Austin. I agree with you there. I'm in sort of the 8 wins. I'm sort of been sitting on that number most of the offseason. Just looking at the schedule, it's, could you maybe get Georgia and Alabama on the right day? Maybe, but probably not. I think you're still, as most teams are, a little bit of a ways away from being able to beat those teams. But there's games you should win. I think you should beat Ball State, Akron, and UT Martin. Missouri and Vanderbilt, I think, are games Tennessee should win. And then there's those 5 toss-up games. Those toss-up games every year are the swing games. Those are the difference between winning 6 and winning 7, like last year. And those are going to be the difference between Tennessee winning 7 and maybe up to 9 this year. So there's 2 of them right off the bat, right, with the Pittsburgh game in the second week of the season. I think that's a game where Tennessee's offensive and defensive lines are going to be tested. I know Pittsburgh lost Kenny Pickett, they lost Jordan Addison, but they still got a lot of guys back, and this is a team that won the ACC last year. So that's not going to be an easy game. The Florida game, who knows what we're going to see from that team this year. What does Anthony Richardson do? He's probably the ultimate wild card for that team. Boomer bust for him. But we may not know what Florida does, but we know what happened when Tennessee plays Florida generally, and it's not good for Vols. So then they got to go to LSU. That's a team that always has talent, although they've lost something like 30 draft picks in the past 3 years. Have some questions on the offensive line, have a quarterback situation they got to get right down there with Brian Kelly in his first season. And then Kentucky and South Carolina, I think, are the other 2 toss-up games. I know South Carolina is probably not. I don't think they were great last season. They were a little bit smoke and mirrors and win 7 games, but that's a tough place to play. Tennessee's always played tough, close games there. You can see that happening again late in the season, and then Kentucky and Tennessee have had some tight games over the years too. So those are the swing games. I've been consistently sitting at 8-4. I'm not going to go game by game here, but I think 8-4 is where I'm at right now, and I do think that would be an improvement over. I think that would qualify as a success. Obviously, it would be improvement from what they did last season, but I think 8 and 9 is a safe range to be in terms of expectations. I don't think that's being too crazy. I think those would be. I think a lot of people would take that right now if that was offered to them.
I will say, I think anything 7-5 or better at least keeps you on track. But I do think a lot of people would view 7-5 as a disappointment, given what Tennessee brings back. Having the senior quarterback, the star receiver, all of those things. Byron Young on defense. You've got enough pieces there that I think people are fairly going to expect more than 7-5. But I think as long as you don't take a step back this year, it's not the end of the world. But I agree, the door is open. You need to. Florida's the big one to me. Florida is down just enough that you need to take advantage if you're Tennessee. That opportunity is not there often. They've lost 16 of 17 in that series, of course. They need to find a way to win that game at home this year. And everything beyond that, we'll see. There's still some swing games that fans are maybe sleeping on, like Kentucky and South Carolina, that Tennessee's still got to take care of business in those games before they can worry about Georgia and Alabama. But I do think 8 wins is a reasonable expectation. That's where I'm still with you, Patrick. I think it's about an 8-win team, but there is that upside for a 9th win. I think 10-2. I know that prediction. Again, Roman Harper and all that stuff. It's out there, and I know a win gets added to the prediction for everyone's total about this time of year.
Mid-August. Yep.
So I get it, but I still think the reasonable optimistic range is 8-4, maybe 9-3 if the stars kind of align Tennessee's ways. So should be a fascinating season either way. Lots to discuss about over the next few weeks leading up to Tennessee's season opener against Ball State. We'll have it all covered for you on GoVols247.com. Please like and subscribe this channel. Plenty of good college football content coming up leading up to the start of the college football season here in the next few weeks. So lots to keep track of, and 24/7 Sports has you covered. For Patrick Brown, I'm Ryan Callahan. Thanks to everyone for joining us and appreciate all your questions. Go check out GoVols247.com for more, and we'll talk to you guys soon.